morning. I'm Larry Souter, and welcome to Stories of Amazing Grace. We're coming to you from Bixter Chapel at the Madison Church of Christ in Madison, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us online. Some of you are listening by way of radio or a podcast, and of course, being part of this live audience. Our theme scripture comes from Romans 8:38 through 39. I am sure that nothing can separate us from God's love, not life or death, nor angels or spirits, not the present or the future, and not powers above or powers below. Nothing in all creation can separate us from God's love for us in Christ Jesus our Lord. My guest tonight is author, speaker, researcher, and TV host David Rives. I got wind of David when I became aware of a new museum in Dickson, Tennessee, called the Wonders Center and Science Museum. David and his brother Murry are co-founders of the museum, which is the largest science museum in the world that upholds biblical values. Through his research, David can answer some puzzling questions for us, hopefully tonight, such as, did God really create the heavens and the earth in 6 literal 24-hour days? Are you sure it wasn't billions of years? What about the Big Bang? How old is the earth anyhow? What about Noah and the flood? Did the water really cover the whole earth? And does it matter if Adam and Eve really existed? And David will share his insights on some of those questions and more, but first watch this video and then you'll meet David Rives.
I think it's amazing.
In the Wonder Center and Science Museum, we are now in the exhibit hall for the Wonders of Zoology, and all of this has been donated. Many of it was actually collected many years ago, and it was going in a dumpster, and we were able to save all of these creatures and now use them for educational purposes. Then we have a feather collection where we can teach you how feathers grow out in matched pairs in birds. Otherwise, if feathers fell out and didn't grow back in perfectly matched pairs, the aerodynamics would be off and they would not be able to fly. So we highlight the design throughout all of the animal kingdom throughout these few exhibit halls here.
Oh, I think it's awesome. This is the second time we've got to be here. I just think it's great that David and the crew has just got something established where Christians can bring their family into a place and learn about the truth of creation.
I am Murry Rives. I'm David's brother. We have been in ministry together for the past 16 years, and we're excited to have the grand opening today of our Wonder Center and Science Museum here in Dickson, Tennessee.
David Rives has devoted his life to researching and revealing God's fingerprints of design throughout the universe. As president of the largest media ministry in the world focusing on origin science, David uses his signature combination of science and history to make the Bible and Christianity come alive. His weekly TV show, Creation with David Rives, airs to hundreds of millions globally on TBN. An expert in science and the Bible, David has authored 2 books and is seen every day on TV with appearances on the History Channel, DirecTV, TBN, CBN, Newsmax, Dr. James Dobson's Radio, and many more. garnering millions of views on social platforms, including Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. David's #1 goal is to impact those he meets with incredible accounts of discovery, biblical accuracy, and science. He shows us that each person is wonderfully made with purpose, a biological miracle from our designer. An award-winning producer, documentary director, and TV host, David has become the most prominent voice for origin science in our age. As an adventurer, David leads dinosaur days, photo safaris to Africa, expeditions into the Grand Canyon, tours of his museum in Tennessee, geology trips to national parks, speaking tours in Great Britain, films for television, and shares the gospel to millions along the way. David's signature phrase for the past 14 years of ministry has been Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God.
Pleased to make welcome David Rives. Come on up.
Thank you.
Have a seat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Let's start with your background a little bit. What prompted you to get into this science and Bible stuff anyhow?
That's a very long story, but
let's make it short.
I want to make a short version of this story and take it back to the time that I was around 10 years old. I'd received my first telescope, and I remember seeing the comet Hale-Bopp through that telescope. And I was amazed. I'd never seen a comet before, but still, it had piqued my interest in science. Let's fast forward a number of years. I'm 16 years old, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. But I did know that I had a passion for astronomy. So I started to connect cameras to the back of telescopes, astrophotography, basically trying to take photos of space through large telescopes. And there's a little bit of an art to it. It takes a lot of practice. Again, this is just a hobby now. But the first time I caught a decent photo, long exposure photography, it was the Great Orion Nebula. Again, I'm 16 years old. Now, if we've ever seen the constellation Orion in the night sky, we remember the belt and the sword. 3 stars for the belt, 3 stars for the sword. But if you look in between the top 2 stars of the sword, you're not going to see a thing. But if you look through a powerful telescope, what you'll see is a nebula. Now, nebula is Latin for cloud, so it's like a cloud of gas in space. And I took a picture of this that you can't see with the naked eye. But when the picture was developed, long exposure, hours and hours and hours later, through my own telescope, my jaw hit the floor. Because I'd always seen pictures in Sky and Telescope magazine. I'd seen Hubble space photography, and I'd always had to say, yeah, that's beautiful, but they probably doctored that up. It can't look that good in real life. And I took the photo for myself. Not only was it just as vivid, just as beautiful, but it had all of these design characteristics in it. And so at 16, I had this pivotal moment where I said, why is this a hobby? Why couldn't I actually use these photos that I'm taking through telescopes for God's glory? And a verse hit me just a few weeks after this happened, Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night after night shows knowledge, but there's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. So it's almost like the heavens are shouting out that there is a grand designer, and that we're not cosmic accidents, the result of chance, mutations, and time. And at that moment, I talked to my brother, Murry, you saw in the roll in there, and I was like, maybe this is something that we shouldn't just keep to ourselves. Well, at 18 years old, he was 19, he's a year older, I was 18, we formed a nonprofit. And I began going around, first in the Middle Tennessee area, then out of state, then out of country, and got invitations all over the world to start sharing about astronomy and how it relates to the Bible. In other words, how astronomy, the study of the heavens, we're not talking about astrology here, we're not talking about the worship of the heavens, but how the study of God's creation within the universe points right back to the design of the Creator himself. That's how it began.
And you saw a bunch of stars when you looked through the telescope. Yeah. Talk to me about the vastness of space.
Yeah. My first book, Wonders Without Number, I wanted to capture the vastness of space, but I wanted to capture it in a way that anybody could understand. Because, hey, I'm just a person, and I learned about this as a passion, but then I started studying astrophysics and astronomy, cosmology and cosmogony, and I realized, hey, we're talking about light years, parsecs, astronomical units. Now, how am I supposed to grasp what a light year is? How are we supposed to know what a parsec or an astronomical unit is? Can we really understand that a light year is the distance that light would travel at 12 million miles a minute after an entire year? Or what about a parsec? We could ask the audience, how many of us know what a parsec is? You know what? I'm just going to explain it.
Okay.
It's the parallax.
Please do.
So simply, it's the parallax of 1 second of arc. So now we can...
Now we know.
Now we know. You see, these kind of terms are so overarching, and yes, they're scientific, but I mean, it's hard for us to grasp them. So I said, what if we could break it down into something that we can all understand? Let's take our closest star. Our closest star is actually the sun, but our closest extrasolar star would be Proxima Centauri. Proxima Centauri is about 4.2 light years away. Now we're going with the light years again. So I could say, hey, I could go to the grocery store and be back 4.2 miles, be back in 10 minutes time, right? But 4.2 light years, you can't correlate it. So what if we could take a ride on our fastest spacecraft, which is, it's now been surpassed, but up until about 2 years ago, it was the New Horizons and the Voyager spacecraft. The Voyager spacecraft is on its way outside of our solar system as we speak, traveling about 40,000 miles per hour. That's pretty fast. Now, miles per hour is something that I can grasp. Almost anybody listening and watching right now can grasp what a miles per hour is, and they know that 40,000 miles per hour is really fast. So let's jump on it, and let's just take a ride to our closest star, Proxima Centauri. 70,000 years later, we would just be pulling up to the gas station on Proxima Centauri.
Wow.
Do you get that now that we've talked about our closest star, we're talking about innumerable distances that can't be comprehended within this universe, and yet we seem like such a tiny speck, but we're very special in the grand scheme of things.
How old is the Earth?
The Earth and the universe is very old, thousands and thousands of years old. About 6,000 if we go with biblical chronology. And it's about...
Some say billions of years.
Yeah.
Even some Christians say billions of years.
Yes.
Why do you say thousands?
Your average astronomer, secular astronomer, is going to say if we look at the Earth, it's about 4.5 billion years old, and if we look at the universe, we're going back 14 billion years, 13.7, 13.8. Well, all of these kinds of terms, again, are very abstract, and they're based on assumptions. So when we look at the age of the universe, we have a lot of clues that we can go by. If we go by the decay of magnetic fields around Uranus and Neptune, and I have a friend who actually did this, his name is Dr. Russell Humphreys. He basically predicted the magnetic field decay of Uranus and Neptune before NASA's probes ever got there. And he did this based on a biblical assumption. He said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to add up all of the ages of people from Adam all the way up to present day, and we're coming up with approximately 6,000 years of universal history. He said, so if the universe was created by God 6,000 years ago, this is a physicist, Dr. Russell Humphreys, a physicist. He said, then I'm going to publish a paper where I look at the math involved and I tell you what the magnetic field of these distant planets should be. So he did, and he published it. Now, this is academic suicide if he's wrong, because what he knew was that the probes from NASA would not reach those planets for several years yet. So his career is going to be over in a couple of years if he gets this wrong. He's published completely erroneous results. He publishes what he thinks the magnetic field is going to be. NASA's probes get there. They're assuming that these planets are over 4 billion years old. And the data comes back from the probes. And the magnetic field decay is not only within the error bars of his calculations, but it is dead on for a 6,000-year-old universe. Now that's pretty powerful, and that's just one of dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of things that we can look at, and we can try to date the age of the universe based on science, and it's matching what the Bible has said from the beginning.
Does carbon dating refute that?
Carbon dating is actually a biblical creationist, one of his best friends, because carbon dating is not good for more than a few 100,000 years maximum. Now here's the deal. You have organic carbon and you've got carbon-14, and regular carbon is going to decay into carbon-14 at a given rate. It's called half-life. There's a science involved. But basically, if we take something that is 100% pure carbon, it's going to decay away into radioactive carbon, carbon-14, at a given rate. All of that carbon should be gone within, say, 100,000 years, at the max. And yet we're finding diamonds with measurable amounts of carbon-14. Diamonds are thought to be several billion years old, but that means that they're maxed out at 100,000 years. We have found C14 in dinosaur bones. Now, dinosaurs, we've been told, roamed the earth 65, 66 plus million years ago, and yet they still have C14. That means that they must be less than 100,000 years old. I could go on and on and on. C14 is actually showing that the millions and billions of years couldn't possibly be correct. And it's only a few other dating methods. Radioactive dating like potassium argon, lead, rubidium, strontium, that seem to push the boundaries and say that things might be millions of years old. But it's based on 3 faulty assumptions that can never be proven, can't be tracked back historically, and therefore, there are a whole lot better dating methods to use than radiometric dating.
Well, can you believe in creation and the Big Bang?
If I'm asked if I can believe in creation or the Big Bang, and the Big Bang at the same time, I would say absolutely. 2 Peter tells us that the heavens and the earth will pass away with a great noise. That's a Big Bang.
The Big Bang's coming later, you're saying.
But it hasn't happened yet. That's right. There's a Big Bang in the future where these heavens and earth will pass away, but that's not what the secularists are talking about. They're talking about a Big Bang that happened 14 billion years ago. And in that, I can confidently say that we actually can't mix the two. There are some Christians that have tried to fit Big Bang chronology within biblical history, but it doesn't work. Now, here's the problem. The Big Bang states that, and I think I covered this in my first book, Wonders Without Number, the Big Bang has this series of events that took place where 14 billion years ago, all the matter is compacted into a tiny spot, which then rapidly expanded, creating space and time as it goes. All right, so in other words, 14 billion years ago, all the matter was in this tiny little space. Well, already we've encountered a serious problem, because where did all the matter come from? You see, the Big Bang Theory does not attempt to explain the origin of matter. It only attempts to explain the origin of time and space. But you have to have all the matter in the universe. This chair is made of matter. You're made of matter. The TV is made of matter. The cameras are made of matter. So it doesn't explain where the matter comes from. And then, as the universe magically develops in this Big Bang model, what happens is planets coalesce from dust clouds and gas clouds. It's very magical, the principles of the Big Bang, all right? So planets are coalescing from dust clouds. But first comes the stars. The stars come first, and as they start to explode, supernovae, then they produce different elements that can form planets. Well, now, we've already encountered multiple contradictions, because last time I read Genesis, it said that the heavens were created, so space was created, but then the earth was focused on at the very beginning. On day 4, the stars were made. Wait a second. The Big Bang says that stars coalesced first, then planets like the earth. So we've run into numerous contradictions that cannot be reconciled if we try to fit the Big Bang into Scripture. And my question to anyone who is trying to do that, which I admit there have been noble attempts, my question is, why do you want the billions of years? Why are you trying to reconcile these things? Science has not given us any demonstration that the earth is billions of years old. So are we trying to fit it in simply because some scientists have told us that the earth is billions of years old? Or are we looking at real science, the raw data, which is actually showing and more accurately representing that we have a universe that is only thousands of years old?
God at the gap term. Explain what that's all about.
Yeah, the gap theory in general, or the God of the gaps?
God at the gap. We don't understand it, so we say,
We just say, oh,
God did it.
Yeah, God did it. That is really a classic, and many times the skeptics will come up to me and they'll say, oh, you just believe in a God of the gaps. So in other words, here's what we mean by this. You've got a universe, and this universe is massive, and there are a lot of science and a lot of physics that go into making a universe, okay? But when we don't understand something fully, many times Christians will say, well, we don't understand that fully. But God can do anything He wants to do, right? He can accomplish it.
Is that a cop-out?
It is a cop-out only in the sense that everybody uses it, all right? Because, let me put it this way. Let's put it this way. Okay, scientists today have a pantheon of gods. Atheistic scientists have many gods.
Such as?
Such as. They're going to say, oh, no. We believe that nature can explain everything. We've rejected God, all right? But I'll tell you this, all right, so how did the universe form? Well, 14 billion years ago, all of the matter in the universe was coalesced into a dense ball that then expanded into space, creating space, time, all of the galaxies, all of the nebulae, which then coalesced into a soup that formed you and I. All right? So nature has accomplished this miracle. Wait a second. What have they just said? They haven't rejected God in favor of naturalistic principles. They've created their own gods. 14 billion years ago, they've elevated time as one of their deities. All right? Given enough time, anything is possible. It's become a god to them. And then what's the next step? Well, then all of the matter coalesced. What caused the matter to coalesce? There are no physics and principles that would explain that. So therefore, it is a magical principle, a god that they've created. And then what do they say? Well, and then inorganic material became you and I because nature provided a way. So Mother Nature is their third god. They have a pantheon of gods that they have replaced the one true God with, and they're saying, oh, we don't need God. No, they do. They need lots of magic. They just don't call them gods. The God of time, the God of natural selection. All of these things have become put on pedestals to the atheistic scientific community, and they don't even realize it.
What is the difference between classical physics and quantum physics?
That is almost too deep to go on to right here. There's a series of quantum physics, of things that we see at the quantum level that can't be fully explained. Not using classical science, not using classical physical models. And again, this is a super deep principle.
Even when you look at something, it changes, right?
That's right. That's right. There was something called...
You can be in New York, and it can be in Nashville, and it will still change because it senses that someone is looking at it.
That's right. There are things like the double slit experiment and other experiments that have been done where things in quantum physics, in physics, will behave a certain way most of the time, but observing them, they behave an entirely different way. Now, how does physical properties, how does it change knowing that you're looking at it? And again, it points to this higher power. I believe that's God, right? Clearly, that is over everything. By Him, all things consist. And that's what it says about Jesus Christ, that He's holding all things together. By Him, all things consist. So in other words, the physics of this world, they're being held together. Gravity itself, us sitting in this chair instead of floating on the ceiling, that all happens because our Creator thought enough about us to form things in an orderly way, and then he allows us to explore those things in the quantum level, in the subatomic level, and he allows us, he gives us two options. We can give him the glory for it, or we can say, oh wow, look at what time and chance has accomplished. And so often, we've fallen into the latter. We've thrown everything to nature. But nature doesn't have a mind. Nature can't create anything. Everything points back to the fact that a design requires a designer. And who is that designer? I know the answer. Most people are unwilling. Most people in the atheistic scientific community are unwilling to accept that.
How do we reach unbelievers who do not believe in God? There's no magic formula.
There is not. And ultimately, they have to be touched.
But I couldn't communicate like you're communicating with all this information about science. How do I do it?
Here's the deal. Science has become a major stumbling block for non-believers and even people on the fence. Because what they've been told is they'll go to church and their pastor says, you can believe the word of God. It's true from beginning to end, okay? But then they go to school, maybe as a young child, as a kindergartner now. They pick up a book about dinosaurs and immediately they're faced with a challenge. My kindergarten book about dinosaurs says that they evolved 66 million years ago and then we came from ape-like ancestors, all right? And then they go to school, and then they go to college, and they take a biology class. And their professor says, well, if you're a Christian and you believe in all this God nonsense, then you can just leave my class. So there's peer pressure involved. And so often, they look at that smart professor who is a PhD. He's smart. He's intellectual in his own right, even though he's deceived about this whole origins debate. But he's very brilliant, and they say, well, with him, we must trust him for science. We'll trust our pastor for some things, but it ends up breaking everything apart, and they don't know what to believe. They're like, well, we're trusting him for science, but then we're trying to trust our pastor, but our pastor's saying you can believe everything in the Bible, but we know everything in the Bible, the historical portion must be false because it says that God made everything and we didn't evolve. He made us. So now they're faced with this conundrum. On science, we probably ought to trust the scientists. All right? And here's where it goes wrong. Science is always true. Science is raw data. Science, that's the facts. But then scientists interpret the data. And for the last 2, 3, 4 generations, there have been scientists who are trained by their professors, and their professors came about it from an atheistic perspective. They were trained by Darwin, okay? So you've got this generational thing where the last scientist was trained by the previous scientist who goes back to this Darwinian view that everything happened by chance. And peer pressure takes over and it becomes almost impossible to overcome that peer pressure. So now the person on the fence says, well, maybe if I'm on the fence, I ought to jump to the science fence and reject God altogether. And what they don't understand is that they're not jumping on the science fence, they're jumping on the science side of the fence. They're jumping into the theoretical, atheistic world that doesn't have good scientific principles to represent it. So here's what we can do. We can, in a very simply way, and this is what I tackled with my second book, 21 Verses Backed by Science, is I gave 21 verses in about 50 pages. It's a short read. Each chapter is very, very easy to understand, where you can read a verse, and I ask the question, does the Bible know best? Is this verse representing good scientific principles? And it is. And I show you very simply how each verse represents a good scientific principle, and yet that verse was written, let's just say 1,000 years, 2,000 years before science was to discover that scientific principle. So now you have to ask the question, well, how did it get it right? If, as the atheist says, the Bible is just a collection of storybooks, of myths written by ancient goat herders. That's what I get in some of my presentations. A skeptic will come up, David, you're a Christian, right? You just believe in this Bible, this collection of myths written by ancient goat herders. To which I always respond, yeah, I'm a Christian. I have faith. And I do believe, you got a portion of this correct, I do believe in a collection of writings called the Bible, written by ancient goat herders. It was written by poets. It was written by kings But you know what it wasn't written by? Scientists. Yet it got the science right. 21 times, just in 50 pages of my book, I show how it got the science right. So if these common people who were shepherds and poets got the science right, how is it possible unless the Bible is what it claims to be? Those people weren't writing it. They were only the tool being used by God. God was divinely inspiring to their minds those words to write down so that thousands of years down the road, it would still be accurate science. People also criticize me and they say, David, you know what? The Bible's not a science textbook, so you need to kind of be careful about this. To which I always reply, you're absolutely correct. Science textbooks have to be rewritten every year.
Let's look at some of those
Yes.
verses that you talked about in your book. Chief dust of the earth.
Yeah.
Proverbs chapter 8. I was set up from everlasting, while as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world, or broken down in Hebrew, the chief dust of the earth.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
I was reading Proverbs one day, and I came across that passage. I've always loved that particular chapter of Proverbs because King Solomon is speaking as wisdom herself in the first person. Now, it's interesting. Solomon is known to be one of the wisest people to have ever lived, and he has the authority to speak as wisdom itself in the first person, all right? So, speaking of wisdom, when I came to this passage, I said, well, what does that mean, the chief dust of the earth? We have to look it up in the original Hebrew and see if we can gather any contextual data to try to figure out what this is. So chief or Rosh, like Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. So it's the head dust of the earth, eretz. So it's talking about, I believe, it's very possibly talking about matter, atomic particles. Now, you could argue, well, what if it's talking about something in the subatomic world? Because we found things in the subatomic world, things like quarks and leptons and bosons, the God particle. You remember the God particle? It hit news a few years ago, and they said, we've discovered the God particle. It's the subatomic particle. And everybody hailed it as this way to reject God, because this is the God particle. And nobody knew exactly what the scientists were talking about, right? So actually, this God particle is a type of a boson. It's a subatomic particle that embodies matter with its mass. It's not creating anything magically. It is just a subatomic particle that works to give matter mass. And so everybody was saying, well, we don't need God anymore because we've got the God particle. It doesn't explain anything about the origin of these things. It only explains a portion. So when we look at that verse, that from the beginning, everything was set up, including the chief dust of the earth, if this is talking about the atomic world, the head of everything, the very origins of everything, then it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So what I say to those types of examples is the Bible knows best. Thousands of years before we would discover individual atoms, the Bible may be discussing the atomic or subatomic world, maybe something we haven't even discovered yet. And that points to greater understanding than even King Solomon could have had at the time. It had to have been divinely inspired.
Questions?
What are your thoughts on why people in the Bible of the olden days lived much longer than we do today?
That's a great question. People in Old Testament days before the flood lived much, much longer than we live today, upwards of 900 years in some circumstances, okay? And there are a number of very good scientific reasons for that. I'm going to give you just a couple. I'm going to throw out a few. Number one, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In the Hebrew, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.
Do that again. I need to take notes on that.
There's going to be a quiz afterwards, and I want it written in perfect Hebrew block characters. No, it goes on to tell us that everything that God created was very good. Okay, so think about this for a second. Adam and Eve were formed very good with a 100% pure genetic code perfect in every way. Now, very soon after that, we messed it up. Sin entered into the world. They decided they could be their own gods. They're like, oh yeah, we can do whatever we want. And sin entered into the world. As a result, things started going downhill. And genetics started to increase in mutations. All right, so mutations are harmful, not beneficial. Mutations entered the world at the time of Adam and Eve, but for the first many generations, those genetics would have been incredibly robust. So Adam and Eve's offspring, their children, their grandchildren, their grandchildren, their grandchildren, they would have been really well designed. Almost very good, right? Almost a perfect design. So they're living longer, they have less disease. I mean, let's face it, mutations cause things like sickle cell anemia. We've got cancers coming in. We've got all of these things, and there were very few mutations at the very beginning. Fast forward into history. Now get this is where it gets interesting. And we see that all the way up to the time of Noah, they're living 600, 700, 900 years in many cases. At the time of Noah's Ark, which was a real, literal historical event, 8 people boarded an ark. 4 of them were related, directly related, Adam and his sons, right? So those genetics were very close. Now, his sons' wives, they would have been different. But there's a genetic bottleneck at the time of the flood, all right? So when everybody got off the ark, the earth is being repopulated from just 8 people, 4 of whom are directly related. Do you see that we see that when there are very close relations in marriages, sometimes the children have birth defects or more mutations than not? And that was the case after the flood. Immediately after the flood, what do we see? If we look at the genealogies within the scriptures, what we're going to find is that lifespans immediately started to decline. Something happened. It was a genetic bottleneck along with probably vastly different conditions as according to our atmosphere. Maybe our oxygen levels were different. Maybe our food supply was different after the flood. But a lot of it had to do with a genetic bottleneck and an increase in mutations at the time of the flood. And it also explains how we have trees that were 150 feet tall before the flood, and today those same plants only grow to 1.5 feet tall. All right, it explains gigantism. It explains longevity. It explains everything when you look at it from a genetics perspective. From a science perspective, everything makes sense when we read what the Bible says. And I think that's pretty encouraging.
Talk about rock layers a little bit and soil erosion and...
Yeah, rock geology. Everybody says, oh, rocks are dull. They're so boring. I love geology. I've actually hiked the Grand Canyon. I've picked up rocks from many different countries. I've picked up fossils from different countries. And
people say the Grand Canyon proves that the Earth is millions of years old.
Millions of years.
But you say no.
I say absolutely not. And very few of those people who say so have actually hiked the canyon themselves, by the way. All right? So here's what we do. We start at the top layer. We're a mile above sea level at the top layer of the Grand Canyon, and we're going to start our journey down. The first layer that we encounter is limestone, and that limestone is full of, guess what? Sea fossils, seashells, bivalves, imprints of marine creatures, a mile up. Sounds like maybe there was a lot of water there at some point. We keep working our way down, and we find sandstone layers that are identical to the sand dunes that are laid underwater, under the Long Island Sound and under the San Francisco Bridge. Okay, so underwater sand dunes. We keep going, and we find mudstone layers, silts, all of these types of layers that are replete, completely filled with fossils from the top to the bottom. And those fossils are not transitional fossils. These aren't things turning into something. No, they're 100% complete creatures buried rapidly within those layers. You get all the way down to the bottom to the bedrock layers, and those are the Zoroaster granites, and there are also some other types of rocks down there. And those bedrock layers, all of a sudden, boom, just like that, no fossils whatsoever, no life forms. Well, those are the pre-flood layers, the layers where in the beginning God said, let the dry land appear. And so we form that dry land, these hard bedrocks of earth, and everything on top of that is full of marine creatures. It's flood layers. We see this all throughout not only the Grand Canyon, but I've been on speaking tours in Colorado Springs, for instance. And in Colorado Springs, there's one spot where you can stand and touch the layers that you find in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The very bedrock layers right on top of the first sandstone, those water-deposited layers. You can do this just outside of Las Vegas. You can do this pretty much anywhere on Earth. We're finding these types of layers that coincide as if there was a global catastrophe, not billions of years of little local floods that just formed all of the rock layers that we see. No, a global catastrophe that reshaped the planet, laying down layer after layer after layer. And those layers were laid down so quickly that they buried fully formed fossils before they were able to decay. For instance, in Kansas, I lead a paleontology dig in Kansas. And in the middle of Kansas, at 2,500 feet above sea level, 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean, we find giant marine predators, 18-foot-long Zophactinus, 5-foot-long Gillicus fish, squids, clams, turtles that have 6, 8, 10-foot diameter shells. We are finding mosasaur parts. I've only found portions of their skulls and their teeth and their vertebrae, but within a few miles of where I dig, 50-foot long, giant marine sea dragons are being found in Kansas, which implies that there was an ocean of water on top of Kansas at some point. Now you might say, okay, well, how do the secularists handle this? How does a skeptic get around this? It looks like the ultimate proof that the earth is only thousands of years old and that there has been a massive catastrophic flood. Well, the secularists would get around this by admitting to it. They say, well, of course, we know, we find these fossils, and the only way to explain it is that there must have been a lot of water here at some point in the past, probably 90 million years. So they just insert time so that it doesn't match the biblical chronology. But that time is artificial. It can't be proven. You don't dig up a bone with a little gift wrap tag that says, I was buried 65 million years ago. No. There are no clear-cut ways to measure the age of these bones, but what we see is massive catastrophic depositions that mud flows, underwater mud flows, that buried these bones so rapidly that they never had time to decay, that scavengers never had time to pick them apart. What happens if an animal in the ocean dies? Fish die in the ocean all the time. I mean, that's just a fact of life. So what happens? Well, they're eaten by something. Or, if they die of natural causes, then scavengers pick them apart and their bones float to the floor. And then bone-eating creatures come and devour some of that. When we do deep sea dives in the ocean, we do not find millions of fossils of dead animals laying along the floor of the ocean. Because when something lays around for any period of time, it decays, it's picked apart, it's scavenged, or it's completely eradicated when it's eaten by another creature. But what we see in the fossil record is absolutely opposite of that. Complete creatures, boom, buried before anything was able to pick them apart. Catastrophic burial.
David?
Yes, sir.
When you present this or have meetings with atheists and with scientists who support the Big Bang Theory, how do they respond to what you have just said?
They would typically respond by saying, we know that we can't prove the Big Bang, and we know that we have a problem with the origin of the matter. But we're not worried about that, because the origin of the matter is for the metaphysicist to figure out, or it's for the geologist to figure out. So then you go to the geologist and you say, well, what do you think about this? How do you explain this? And they're like, that's not for us to figure out. That's for the biologist to figure out, and that'll tell. So you go to the biologist, you ask the PhD biologist who's a skeptic, who's an atheist, the same question, and they're like, we're not worried about the very origin of life. We're only studying life as we see it and the evolution of life. That's for the, and they keep pushing it to someone else.
They don't have an answer, so they're passing the buck.
They're passing the buck. That's exactly right.
I am not a scientist, and I'd be the first to say it. I taught English, but quantum physics has always fascinated me. Do you see it as basically a theoretical science?
Currently, there is a lot of it that is theoretical science. As we learn more, I believe that at some point we're going to encounter this pivotal moment where things all of a sudden become more cemented, and maybe we understand it. But really, that brings me back to the title of my first book. It's based off of a verse in the book of Job that says that God does great things past finding out and wonders without number. If you chew on that for just a little bit, what we realize is that God has done an infinite number of wonders, wonders without number, that we can study, that we can admire. But there are also things past our comprehension. There are mysteries that in this life we will never know. And I'm okay with that. Some scientists are not. And some people say, no, we have to find the answers to everything. But I believe that that's what transcends us as humans. In other words, we have a greater power, the God of the Bible who created us, and He has the ultimate wisdom and knowledge for everything. But He created us in His image, which means that we have the mental capacity to be able to understand many of those physics and scientific principles and study them. But there are still going to always be some mysteries. I don't know how many are related to the quantum physics realm, but I do know that at this point, a lot of it is still on the theoretical side.
Well, by virtue of the word theoretical, that defies a scientific stance.
Correct. This defies a scientific stance because science, in and of itself, comes from the word scientia,
To know.
which is to know, knowledge. So science is simply knowledge of the natural world. If we don't have knowledge of the way it works, then it's theoretical. All right? Science should be empirical, observable, demonstrable, and repeatable. I was in the bottom of the Grand Canyon one day. I was on a filming schedule for a documentary. And I was at Lee's Ferry, and this is the starting point of the rafting trips down the Colorado River. So after I finished my piece, the cameras were turned off. I saw this lady. She was off in the distance loading up rafts on the on-ramp right there. So I walked over to her, cameras off, and I was just started a conversation. Hey, what you doing? She said, well, I'm loading up this raft. We're about to head off on a 16-day journey down the Colorado River, a Grand Canyon rafting trip. And I gasped a little bit, and I'm like, man, I don't even know if I could handle that. That's a long time on a raft, but good on you. So she turns around, and she asks me, what are you doing here? So I'm like, oh, this is a great opportunity to maybe share a little truth. So I said, well, I'm actually shooting an on-location documentary about how this canyon may have been formed very rapidly with a lot of water over a short period of time. She says, oh, and she goes back to loading the raft. So I'm like, opportunity missed, obviously. No, but in my peripheral vision, I see this tall, lanky fella come storming from behind a Jeep in the distance. He's been listening to our conversation. He's the leader of the raft trip. He said, did I hear you say that you think that this canyon formed rapidly with a lot of water over a short period of time? And I was like, well, yes, I do believe that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. He said, my PhD is in geology, and I'm here to tell you that this canyon formed over 6 million years of slow, gradual erosion as this Colorado River wore through the layers and formed the canyon. And I said, well, I understand that you believe that, but could I just ask you some questions? And he said, oh, certainly. What would you like to know? And I said, well, have we ever seen a canyon form over 6 million years of slow, gradual erosion, a canyon like this, from a river like this? And he said, Well, absolutely not. We as a species haven't been around for 6 million years to even observe such a thing take place. I said, but you do believe that, right? And he said, well, of course I believe that. I said, well, can I ask you another question? He said, well, absolutely, anything. What do you want to know? I said, well, can we do some type of a scientific test, maybe like a simulation in a lab, to show how a canyon like this could be formed from a river like this over 6 million years of slow, gradual erosion? And he said, well, no, it's not like a test we could do or any kind of a simulation. I said, but you do believe that's the way it formed over 6? And he said, well, of course I believe that. And I said, and of course you believe it by faith. And he said, well, of course. No. He was flabbergasted. A PhD in geology with 2 questions. And what he realized in that moment was that he had a faith-based belief that could not be repeated, could not be tested, was not empirical, was not scientific in any way. It was simply what his professor had taught him. Now, did that change his mind? Probably not that day. But guess what? I like to think he had the next 16 days going down the Colorado River looking at those rock layers to think about it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, I'm always wondering, Christ came and was in the flesh. Do you ever think about his DNA?
That is a very good question, and I have actually thought that through. It would be interesting to know what that would look like.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very possibility that there would be unusual chromosomes because he only had one physical parent, right? But we don't know all of the answers to that, and it is a very interesting question to posit, but I can't say that I have too much to add.
Do you know Ron Wyatt?
Yeah, I knew Ron before he passed away. Yes.
He claimed that he found Noah's Ark, claimed that he found the site of the crucifixion.
Yes.
I believe he also claimed that he found the shed blood of Jesus.
Yes. Yes.
Do you believe any of that or not?
I have done some research into those claims, and I have also worked extensively with the Israeli Antiquities on projects, even where the crucifixion would have likely taken place, at Golgotha, the place of the skull. I've been 30 feet underground to actual first century level near the Garden Tomb, and I've seen some of those areas firsthand. I believe that there's a lot of credence to some of those historical sites. But then there's a lot of skepticism, on the other hand, that when I look at things, we have faith as Christians. We have faith that Christ lived, died, and was raised again. But then when it comes to the science world, when it comes to archaeology, as Indiana Jones says, archaeology is not an exact science. And so it's very hard to go back in history and absolutely prove one way or the other. And in a lot of cases, that's the situation that we're placed in, where we have to look at the evidence objectively and figure out, well, is this the most likely spot for this? Is this the most likely spot for this? And in some cases, I think there's a lot of credence to some of those sites.
Talk a lot about theories that haven't been proven. I know in math, when you have a theory, you've got a hypothesis, you've got to prove it.
Yeah.
How does science take these theories that haven't been proven and now they're being taught formally as the truth?
Well, they're teaching them as fact, but they're simply theoretical. Now, there is a place where theory holds an important place in science, okay? Because everything is going to be at one point or another a theory. But when there's enough data to support that theory, then it might become an actual scientific law, right? One example might be abiogenesis that Louis Pasteur pioneered. He's looking and he says, well, we've never seen life come from non-living material. Right? We've never seen a rock turn into an astronaut, okay? That's basically what he's saying. And in all of our observations in science, that's held true. So that would actually fall as a scientific law. We've experienced it billions of times. Think about this. There's inorganic material. There's actually formerly organic material in most every can of soup that you buy, whether it's a can of beans or a can of soup or a can of chicken, right? But we have never cracked open that can and the chicken comes springing forth. It's come back to life. In other words, dead things don't turn into living things. That's abiogenesis. Life only comes from living things. It never comes from rocks, dead soup, dead inorganic materials. And so in that case, if we've experienced this millions, billions of times as a society, and it's always held true, then that's going to be a scientific law. But right now, things like the Big Bang Theory, things like Darwinian evolution or universal common descent, the idea that everything in the universe descended from one common ancestor, a little amoeba that sprang forth sometime millions and millions of years ago, all of that is theoretical. It can't be proven. And it's being taught as fact to unsuspecting children, to unsuspecting grandchildren. And more importantly, this is not just about the science. This is an ethical thing as well, y'all. It's because we are being taught, and our young children are being taught, that they're accidents of the cosmos, nothing more than random chance, star stuff over 14 billion years, and that they were evolved from ape-like ancestors. Now let me put it this way. How would you feel if I told you that you were nothing more than star stuff, an accident of the cosmos, and that you evolved from ape-like ancestors? Are you surprised that suicide rates are shooting through the roof with teens, that there are 22 veteran suicides per day, that there are school shootings taking place within society? Are you surprised, being what we're teaching our young people is that life is worthless? There is nothing to life. We live, we die, that's all there is. You're nothing more than a monkey. And people are going out and they're acting like monkeys. It's the truth. And this is what we've been taught for the last few generations. I'm not surprised that society is going downhill fast. A lot of atrocities are taking place as a result of this teaching of theory over factual scientific data. And that's a shame.
Period.
Period.
And we're over time. Thank you for being with us.
Yes,
Thank you
sir.
so much.
Yes, sir.
Your two books are Wonders Without Number and 21 Verses Backed by Science. They're available at creationsuperstore.com, correct?
That's it.
Well, your theme is from Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. And it goes on to say, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for joining us on Stories of Amazing Grace. And for the live audience, have a safe trip home. Good night.